All right, hello everybody. Today is March 24th, 2022. Oh, and today it's the SIG Architecture Community Meeting for Kubernetes. Jordan cares. Thank you, Jordan. Um, and so, all right, I think we just have one agenda item today, and let's get started. Patrick, I think it's your item.
Yeah, okay. So we talked about this pull request that I have open in component-based logs about how to organize the API. We discussed that part, I think, end of last year, and we decided that moving all into one structure is the right way to go. This is the main part of that pull request. But we also discussed how to then control access to functionality that is considered alpha or beta, because that's no longer part of a V1 alpha feed, configuration structure. It's all in a V1 alpha, V1 structure, and we need additional methods of communicating to users that they are using something that's unstable or hasn't graduated yet. Part of that is documentation. That's all in place in the structure comments and in the command line descriptions. But then there's a question of what to do with feature gate checks, the way how traditionally it has been done. And I noticed when trying to implement that I can't do it the same way as in other packages, simply because component base itself can't use the default feature gate instance. And I brought it up on Slack a while back, and Jordan suggested that the component-based package needs to be special and should accept an explicit parameter for the feature gate instance that it's supposed to check. And I did implement that. I just find it awkward because suddenly we have an explicit parameter in the API that users normally don't care about, but we need to pass it in, otherwise the feature gate checking doesn't work. And that's odd. No other package does it like that. And therefore I want to raise the question again, if it really has to be the way it's currently, or whether we can do what I've implemented in the current version of a pull request, whether we can move the default feature gate instance from K8s API server, where it's currently living, down into component-based feature gates. And just to be clear, I'm only suggesting to move this one default instance of a feature gate. Nothing else changes. Where features get added to that instance is the same as before. Basically, whenever something has a feature gate, it defines the feature gate, it makes sure that it gets added to that default feature gate instance. And then there's this global variable that gets controlled by the feature gate's command line parameter, and everyone is happy. And I just want to do the same thing in component base without having to jump through any additional hoops. And that's one thing. I can also point out the other thing that Elana brought up when reviewing this, and that is which kind of feature gates we should have in that PR, whether it's the same as, I think, the CPU manager thing, that is the precedent that I'm following here, whether we have permanent logging alpha options and logging beta options as a catch-all for individual features that are behind those gates and get enabled via additional options in the configuration or in the command line parameters. That's the second aspect. I think that we went through that before. I've linked to the Google Groups discussion where this has been discussed. I just wanted to refresh everyone that this is also something we're planning to do here. The main contentious point is what to do with default feature gates, because John basically said that it needs to be different. I want to discuss that.
What order do we want to discuss this in? Because mostly just like I have some comments on the default feature gates. I started reviewing this PR. I haven't gotten through all of it. There's just a lot of code moving around, and like with thousands of lines kind of being like thrown around and moved, it's really difficult to do the diffs, especially because like Git isn't recognizing a lot of them as moved files, or like, with restructured stuff. So thus far, like looking at that PR, really the only major comment that I have is like, I think it's good to try to like version this a little bit better and to like section off the versioning into sections. I think like the overall goal of like making these logging configurations its own API and component based with a view, like that's good. I don't think the way that we're doing feature gates right now makes any sense. Like the idea that we have a perma alpha feature gate set and a perma beta feature gate set, that doesn't jive with the way that we do feature gates with the rest of Kubernetes. Like there is a feature that gets tracked through a life cycle, and at some point it graduates and then the feature gate goes away. The last time that we had a discussion similar to this was for some CPU policy stuff within Kubelet, where people were asking, can we just have like an experimental feature gate where things are in there all the time for these policies? I said, well, like at that point, like why is this even in tree? We don't want to have perma alpha stuff. So that was my feedback on that. I don't know, Jordan, if you have more to add. I was not aware that there was a Google Groups thread on this, so I'll try to catch up on
that. The CPU manager discussion, I think I came in after the discussion and was trying to catch up. And I think the rationale for that was that those features are config driven and opt-in. And so the feature gate is really just there to keep you from accidentally using an alpha thing in a config, not realizing it's alpha. Like if you want to, you don't want to have individual control over those things and you need to turn one of them off for some reason, like you can do that by turning it off in a config. And so there's two main reasons we have feature gates. One is to allow gating off problematic code if it breaks something. And that didn't really apply to the CPU manager case because you can, if one particular aspect is problematic, you can like turn off that aspect in the config. The other reason we have feature gates is to make people explicitly opt in to pre-release stuff. And so doing that in a, like as a whole, like I'm opting into alpha CPU manager things didn't seem terrible. I take your point that if we always are going to have an alpha like omnibus feature gate, that's weird. Presumably, hopefully, the feature will complete, and then we're not going to be adding more alpha stuff. And then at that point, I guess we could clean up the alpha. I don't know. I kind of want to talk about the location of the feature gate registry, because that's what's blocking Patrick right now. So there are two main things that have been problematic in the past that are sort of global variable magnets. And one is command line flag registration. That used to happen sort of globally into the global flag registry. And the other is feature gate registration. And both of those things being treated as globals have made testing more difficult, have made it harder to understand the boundaries between components. We've run into situations where a flag was being registered by one component and then used by another component as a side effect. And when we started breaking up some of the sort of monolithic binaries, we realized, oh, this component is using a flag, but it isn't actually registering a flag. And so that sort of side effect, we happen to be in the same binary, so I guess we will see each other's registered things. That's what we're trying to avoid by putting the registry inside component base.
I get what you're saying, and I fully agree these global variables are problematic. But in this case, it is already a solved problem in some sense that we understand that feature gates are global and need to be unique because things break otherwise. it's just that I don't see why we now need to solve this problem for component base without addressing it elsewhere.
I think because component base is supposed to be this building block. And so if I'm going to use like the leader election component, it's reasonable for me to ask that component, like, register your flags into this flag set, register your features into this feature gate instance. And then I will monkey with the config or do whatever I want, and then I will instantiate you and you will run. Like that sort of building block without the component library, assuming it is only running one instance or is the only thing in the process.
So you're basically saying we hold it component based to a higher standard than the rest of the code.
Not the rest of the code. There are other places in the code that we don't let do this already. So things like admission. Admission does not, or it shouldn't. We've swept it multiple times and we try to hold it to this standard. It doesn't use a global feature gate. It is given an instance of a feature gate when it initializes, and it pulls out the values that it needs from the feature gate.
Okay. I think I get what you're saying now. It's not about the conceptual locate, or it's not about the logic or the place of the feature gate. It's really about whether component base should have an explicit parameter or use a global instance.
Yeah.
I tried both.
A good example, if you imagine leader election and logging, it's not impossible to imagine those components being used multiple times in the same process, right? Especially leader election or something. And so it's not like instead of those things taking global dependencies, we want them to be just given the parameters how they should operate.
I understand that, but I just fail to see the use cases for feature gates in this case here, because I can't imagine that we will have a component where feature gates are getting set differently, in particular for logging, which is basically getting configured once per process, except for tests. But yeah, but then in tests, we already have this defer thing with temporarily changing feature gates for all of the other code too. So solving it for component base doesn't help us at all.
Well, the changing it globally in unit tests was definitely a stopgap. Doing that means we can't run our tests in parallel. Like it already has that implication.
Yeah.
But if we move the registry to component base, it would be like opening Pandora's box. Like even if narrowly,
I don't think so. That just means that right now, what everyone else is doing, they just import the API server package and use the global instance. And the only package that can't do that is component base itself.
Yeah, like I said, in places where we can, we are actually requiring
if that is the argument, okay, well then I would like to have, say, I don't know, some code reviewer look at the alternative solution, which I linked in the PR, and say whether that actually is a better API for component base, whether that is useful enough to have the additional complexity, because it trickles up. We have component-based CLI, which is actually where people indirectly initialize logging. So we also need to extend that API to pass in a feature gate. I've implemented that, and I can easily swap back to that solution if that is the direction. But I found it ugly, to be honest, and not useful, because it doesn't really change how this will end up landing in Kubernetes binaries. They will still have a single feature gates command line that is bound to the global default, and that is what everyone that needs to pass into component base. And I don't see that ever being any different, except that it's more complicated. But that's all. If that is the direction, yeah, we can do that.
I mean, I've talked a lot. I'm happy to let other people who have worked with feature gate stuff or tried to tease apart binaries in the same build tree weigh in if they think I'm off base. I'm happy to hear other folks.
I'm pretty sure I was the guy that wired the feature gate so that it is required for instantiation of our admission plugins. And so you wire it and pass an instance through. And what I found when I was teasing these parts apart is that the distinction between having a truly global instance across the entire binary or living in one repo that's canonical for everyone versus having access from library code to this is where mine is was noteworthy. And so I'm actually in favor of having multiple instances because I think it makes the long-term maintenance easier as you start trying to depend on additional pieces and limit conflicts in a single magnet.
Do you see that as being like a top level thing? Like the command is going to set up its command line flags, set up its feature gate, set up its logging. Logging is a good example of a thing that is normally configured in the main package.
Yeah, I would see it as one instance per binary that gets registered with the different places that need to use it.
Okay, well, I guess then that's the direction for component base 2, and I can update VPR. It's not a big deal. I just really don't think it's useful, but I'm fine with if that is what everyone is happy with, and then we'll just change it. I think we can still change the APIs in component base. It's not too troublesome. One thing that I found, for example, is that I actually had to change the infrastructure code a little bit. The feature gate enabled parameter assumes that the feature gate that it's supposed to check, or feature, yes, it's a bit confusing with the terminology because we always talk about feature gates, but the code talks about features and feature gate and one feature gate instance. So what it's checking is must have been registered, otherwise the code panics. And
yeah, that's intentional. So
but then we have another failure mode where a feature gate gets passed into a component or in a library function. The library function expects its feature to be registered and calls enabled, and then it panics because the caller didn't set up the feature gate correctly. And well, if that's intentional, we basically have to say you have to pass in a feature gate, and this feature gate must have the following following features registered, which becomes very hard to document at the highest level, because then you basically need to know at the top level what feature gates might be used anywhere in the code where you pass through that feature gate instance.
So I was expecting the component to register the feature gates, that it like register its own feature gates, just like it registers its own command line flags.
Yeah, but then we need another API for now register your feature gates. Okay, yeah, okay, well that works. But then what if that component is called indirectly? So so say a component uses just component-based CLI. Component-based CLI calls component-based logs. Now we need to have a new API in component-based logs for registering feature gates, and we must have the same thing in component-based CLI, which calls component-based logs to register the feature gate flags. It trickles down through all of the components that are involved in that chain, just because we want to avoid the global default feature gate. And that's actually the situation right now. Some code some components just use component-based CLI, and the run method handles log initialization, basically as like a framework thing.
Mm-hmm.
And now I need to add new APIs to both of these packages to do the non-default, non-global feature gate thing.
I mean, I feel like in some ways this is like we had a very unconfigurable logging surface for a long time. Like it just, everything was a global method and it did what it did.
Um,
And then all the configuration got added as global flags, basically. And now we're saying, no, we actually want to be able to configure this, like nest the configuration inside the kubelet config or the scheduler config or something. Like we don't want this global config. And it's revealing that we didn't actually have an instance of the logging component that was being configured. It's still this weird mix of global config and an instance. And so I think what we're talking about is we want it to be an instance, and that instance can say, hook up my command line flags and register my feature gates, and then handle logging and be confident that my features are known to the system.
Well, I'll do one thing. I'll change the PR to this other alternative implementation, and then I don't know, Jordan or Elana can look at it again and say that this looks right, this looks reasonable, and if it does, then yeah, okay, let's pick back that alternative. And if not, we can go back and swap out with the current content of the PR and move the default feature gate instance. Does that sound okay? I do have a code. It's really old. I need to pick the thing because I had to rebase the main branch that I've been working on for a while, but it's not too hard.
I was trying to think if the single version stuff could be done separately from the feature gate plumbing, but I guess the reason we wanted to do that was so that if we were going to have a V1 API,
we want to have a feature gates immediately, which actually brings me to a third topic. Which I noticed when looking at this PR again. We have traditionally had, say, logging output JSON as an alpha feature, and now it's beta. But now, if we add the feature gate check, suddenly people would no longer be able to use logging format JSON like we did in the previous release. They would also have to enable the corresponding feature gate.
If we say it's beta, then it's reasonable for the feature gate to be enabled by default.
Okay, you're right. Beta would be enabled. So okay, yeah. I retract that. It would be the alpha features, which we still have, but those are fairly new. I think that is reasonable. And yeah, okay, never mind. I got confused about the enabled state of beta again. Yeah, okay. Good. Thanks, guys, for listening. And I hope you enjoyed the discussion. It is interesting, sometimes a bit confusing, but we'll see where we land.
Yeah. Thanks for your patience. I know it's tedious when, like, yeah, I know it's tedious. I'm sorry.
I don't know. You're right. It is, but it's necessary. I mean, we all want to have good software, so it is sometimes necessary to talk about what's best and hash it out.
I'll take a look too at the alternative and see if there's a way we can make it user friendly and also sort of isolated. So I'm open to tweaking where things go or changing signatures on things to make it clear, to make it harder for people to make mistakes. So we can think about anything there.
Okay. I think that's all for now then.
Okay.
Sorry.
We had that other topic that we want to discuss around the whether we have multiple feature gates, one for each option, or we have one controlling alpha beta. Did we want to talk about that, or?
Maybe people who were there for the CPU discussion can correct me, but my understanding was we didn't really need the granularity of one gate per feature, as long as we also had the granularity of one config field per feature.
Yeah. And this is exactly the same situation that we have here now. So I basically picked the same solution to the same problem.
So basically with the CPU manager one, you would be enabling, in order to use a particular option value, you would be enabling a feature gate specific to that option value. And so basically, and it's the same person, right? It's not like you had one person who would enable the feature gate and a different person who would configure the option. It's the same person in the same command line.
Right.
And it's just sort of like, oh, I'm going to put 2 options in instead of 1. What's the value here? So that's why we did it that way. I don't know if that's the same here or not.
Yeah, as opposed to API fields where the admin is deciding what's on or off, and the end users are putting data in. Yeah.
Exactly.
Also, there's one instance of the config file. So if you want to turn a feature off, you just comment out that field in that config file, as opposed to like an API where there's 1,000 copies and we want to like stop new stuff from coming in and then like have to dig through what's already there. Like that dynamic just doesn't exist the same way here.
Yeah. So Alana, I think you were the one who was concerned. Did you have any other, does this make sense to you now, or?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. All right, then if there's no other topics, let's all get back half an hour.
Sorry, John, I just thrown in another topic, sorry. As we were talking, I updated API Snoop, and there is new endpoints that came in probably this week. Storage capacity. I assume because it relates to storage, it would be ineligible, but they are brand new with no conformance tests.
It's
Sorry,
eligible. It has an API test that is qualified for conformance, but we were asked to merge it as a regular E2E and let it demonstrate stability.
Oh,
So
yes, I saw that test. Okay, so that covers it. I saw that happening, yes.
As soon as it has enough green history for the conformance folks, we can flip it to conformance.
Okay, yes, I think that's from Patrick as well. I saw that coming through.
Okay, awesome. Then that sounds like that's not an issue. Okay, well, thank you, everybody. Have a great couple of weeks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheers.